It was a chilly autumn morning. Henry walked slowly down the main street of the neighborhood, where merchants were already opening their shops. He waved to some acquaintances and smiled at the children passing by on their way to school. Henry stopped in front of a coffee shop to warm his hands with the steam coming from the chimney. While standing there, a local merchant, Mr. Johnson, walked by and noticed something shining on his wrist. "Hey, wait a minute," Mr. Johnson shouted, pointing at Henry. "That watch. Where did you get it?" Henry glanced at his watch, an intricately detailed gold model. "This watch? It's a long story, sir. I've had it for many years." "That's a lie. That watch was stolen from my shop last week." Mr. Johnson was furious, and before Henry could explain, the merchant called the police. Within minutes, a police car arrived, and 2 officers, including Detective Parker, stepped out. "What's the problem here?" Parker asked, looking from Mr. Johnson to Henry. "This man has my watch. It was stolen from my shop," Mr. Johnson quickly explained. The officers approached Henry. "Come on, old man. We're going to need you to come with us," one of the officers said while handcuffing Henry. "I didn't steal anything," Henry protested calmly. "I can explain." But the officers were not willing to listen. "You can explain this at the station." Henry was taken to the police station, where he was placed in a cold, damp cell. He was tired and hungry, but his dignity remained intact. Sitting on the hard bench, he thought about the injustice he was suffering. At the station, Detective Parker began to interrogate Henry. "So, Henry, you say you didn't steal the watch. How do you explain being in possession of it?" Henry sighed. "I told you, I made this watch. I made it for a young man I helped many years ago. He gave it to me as a gift when he was traveling." Parker rolled his eyes. "A convenient story, but without proof, you'll stay here." Alice was at the local newspaper office when she heard about Henry's case. Curious and concerned, she decided to investigate. Alice always believed there was more to stories than meets the eye. She went to the station and asked to speak with Henry. "I'd like to interview Mr. Henry if possible," she told Detective Parker. "What do you want with him?" Parker asked skeptically. "I'm a journalist, and I think there might be more to this story," Alice replied, trying to sound confident. "Good luck," Parker scoffed. "He denies everything, but we have witnesses." Alice was led to a small room where Henry sat, head bowed. "Mr. Henry, I'm Alice, a journalist. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Henry looked up and met Alice's eyes. "I swear, miss, I didn't steal that watch. I made it many years ago." Alice was intrigued. "You made the watch? Can you tell me more about it?" Henry sighed and began his story. "I was a watchmaker. I had my own shop, was successful. This watch was a special order. I made it for a young man named Michael Thompson. He was like a son to me." Alice scribbled everything down frantically. "And what happened next?" "My wife and daughter died in a car accident. I lost everything. The shop, my home, everything. Since then, I've been living on the streets," said Henry, his eyes welling up. Alice felt a pang in her heart. "I'll investigate further, Mr. Henry. I'll find out the truth." Meanwhile, Alice was determined to prove Henry's innocence. She dedicated herself to researching his story, interviewing people who might know him. Alice learned more about Henry's past, including his renowned work as a watchmaker and the tragedies that led him to live on the streets. Alice spent several nights in libraries and archives, poring over old records under the dim light of yellowed lamps. Each page turned was a promise of forgotten secrets as she delved into dusty documents and thick, creaking books. On one particularly quiet night, she found a faded article about Henry's workshop. The worn ink still clearly outlined Henry's reputation as one of the city's finest watchmakers, known for his almost mystical precision in the art of watchmaking. Moreover, she discovered the name of Michael Thompson, an influential businessman whose success had begun humbly. He often mentioned in old interviews a watchmaker who had helped him when nothing else seemed promising. Alice knew this was a crucial clue. Armed with this information, she decided she needed to find Michael to corroborate Henry's story. After some attempts, she managed to schedule an interview at Michael, a man of imposing stature with silver hair, looked at Alice with an expression of surprise and concern. "Henry? I know Henry very well. He was like a father to me during tough times. What happened to him?" The concern in his voice was palpable. Alice took a moment to explain the delicate situation. He's being accused of stealing a watch that, according to him, he made especially for you many years ago." Michael nodded gravely, his eyes darkening with the memory of that time. "Yes, he made a watch for me. It's a masterpiece, and one of my most cherished possessions. I left it with him just before I needed to move countries. I need to help Henry." While Alice worked tirelessly to prove Henry's innocence, the local community was at a crossroads of opinions. Some residents still suspected Henry, while others, influenced by Alice's meticulous articles, began to see the situation in a new light. "We can't judge a person just by their appearance or baseless accusations," defended a neighbor who had known Henry since he was married. "He has always been a polite and kind man, dedicated to his art." "But what if he's lying? How can we know the truth?" questioned another resident during a heated debate at the local market. Henry's story not only divided the community, but also became a hot topic of discussion, with many eagerly awaiting the next chapter of Alice's efforts to uncover the truth. The atmosphere in the police station was charged with tension when Michael Thompson strode through the double doors with firm steps and a resolute expression. His elegant suit and determined look made him stand out amid the bureaucratic routine of the place. With a serious expression, he headed straight to the counter where Detective Parker was organizing some papers. In the interrogation room, the air was charged with palpable tension. Detective Parker, a man of rigid posture and penetrating gaze, fixed his skeptical eyes on Michael Thompson. The bare walls and the cold light of the place only intensified the atmosphere of confrontation. "My name is Michael Thompson," he announced clearly, extending a steady hand. "I am the owner of the watch in question. Henry made this watch for me as a gift many years ago." Parker, a middle-aged man with features marked by time and a weary posture, looked up surprised. "Are you saying Henry didn't steal the watch?" he asked, his voice mixing incredulity and curiosity. "Exactly," replied Michael, his voice laden with firmness. "Henry is an honorable man. He would never steal anything. He helped me when I needed it most, and I'm here to return the favor." Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Parker nodded and led Michael to the restricted area where Henry was detained. The doors creaked, and the corridors echoed with the steps of the two men. As they approached the cell, Henry, who was sitting on a wooden bench, looked up. His eyes lit up upon recognizing Michael. "Michael, you came." His voice was a mix of relief and hope. "Of course I came, Henry. You don't deserve to be here," replied Michael, approaching the bars that separated them and extending his arms for a brief embrace. "Let's sort this out." Michael then returned to where Parker was, pulling out a folder of documents and photographs that proved the watch's origin. He showed old photos of the two of them, young and smiling, with the newly completed watch on display. "Look, this is proof that the watch was a gift from Henry to me," Michael explained, pointing to the dates and details in the images. Without hesitation, Michael placed a second folder on the metal table and pointed to a faded receipt, protected by a plastic cover. "Here's the receipt for the watch, dated 20 years ago. It was issued by Henry's workshop," he explained, his voice firm, conveying confidence. He moved to a faded photograph, where he appeared wearing the watch at a charity event, his jovial smile contrasting with the seriousness of the current moment. "And here's a photo of me wearing the watch a few years later." Michael then presented a set of yellowed bank records. "These are the records that show the money transfer I made to Henry as payment for the watch," he added, sliding the papers towards Parker. As Parker examined the documents with meticulous attention, Henry, seated next to Michael, watched every move of the detective with hopeful eyes. The silence was only interrupted by the sound of pages turning and the contained breathing of those present. With the new evidence in hand, Parker reviewed the documents with an increasingly convinced expression. After a few moments of deliberation, he sighed and shook his head. "It seems we made a mistake," he admitted, starting the process to release Henry. As the papers were filled out and the cell keys sought, news of Henry's imminent release began to spread. Some officers at the station, who had followed the case closely, exchanged looks of surprise and relief. Deep down, many there felt that something about the case didn't fit, and Michael's intervention brought the clarity that was missing. It was then that Alice, the investigative journalist with a knack for timely revelations, burst into the room. She held a yellowed newspaper clipping, which fluttered slightly in her anxious hands. "Detective Parker, I found more evidence," she announced, handing the clipping to Parker with a decisive gesture. "This is an article about the opening of Henry's workshop. It's clear that he was a respected watchmaker in the community." Parker took the clipping and read the article with an expression that slowly shifted from doubt to contemplation. Upon finishing, he sighed deeply, his demeanor softening. "All right," he finally said, placing the documents on the table. "Everything seems to indicate that Henry is telling the truth. I'll talk to the chief and see what we can do to resolve this situation." The relief was almost palpable. Michael placed a comforting hand on Henry's shoulder, who, although still cautious, allowed himself a timid smile. Alice, satisfied with the decisive contribution of her discovery, leaned back against the wall, watching the scene unfold. The prospect of justice, finally, seemed not just possible, but imminent. After a series of intense phone calls and a last meticulous review of the documents, Detective Parker returned to the detention room with a visibly lighter expression. "Henry, I'm sorry for the confusion. You're free to go," he declared, as he turned the heavy lock on the cell door. The sound of metal sliding announced the change in Henry's fate. Henry stood up slowly, his body still carrying the weight of uncertainty and fear that had accumulated during his detention. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to settle not just his disheveled strands, but also his thoughts. "Thank you, Detective. And thank you, Michael. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." His voice was a mix of gratitude and relief as he extended his hand to shake Michael's. Michael returned the handshake with a warm smile and a heartfelt embrace. "You would have done the same for me, Henry, and you did many years ago," he replied, recalling the tough days when Henry's friendship and skill had been his safe harbor. Meanwhile, Alice watched the scene with a twinkle in her eyes and a smile that lit up her face. She knew she was witnessing a story of injustice, friendship, and redemption that touched on deep human issues. "This is a story the world needs to hear," she murmured more to herself than to the others, as she feverishly scribbled in her notebook. Each detail captured by her pen was a seed of truth that would soon blossom in her next big report. As Henry walked out of the cell, his steps echoed through the corridor, marking not just his physical freedom, but also the restoration of his dignity. Michael walked closely beside him, shoulder to shoulder, reinforcing the indelible bond that united them. Parker watched the scene, feeling a mix of relief and introspection. He knew that cases like Henry's were a reminder of the responsibility he carried in his hands and the importance of meticulousness in his profession. As they left the police station, Henry, Michael, and Alice were greeted by the fresh afternoon air, which seemed to celebrate with them the resolution of a tumultuous journey. Alice, already planning her next step, knew that this story would not only fill the pages of her newspaper, but also echo in the conversations of many who sought justice and truth in an often dark world. As Henry, Michael, and Alice emerged from the shadows of the station, they were greeted by a vibrant group of residents who gathered at the entrance. The buzz of conversations and laughter momentarily ceased as they spotted the three. Quickly, the silence was broken by a wave of warm applause and exclamations of relief and happiness. "We knew you were innocent, Henry," shouted a middle-aged woman, owner of a small bookstore in the neighborhood, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "Welcome back, Henry," echoed a young man, the local barber, as he extended his hand for a firm handshake. As words of support floated through the air, Henry looked around, his eyes welling up at seeing so many familiar faces. "Thank you, everyone. I never imagined I would have so much support," he said, his voice choked with emotion. In the days following Henry's release, news of his innocence spread like wildfire through the town. The story, laden with injustice and redemption, captured the imagination and hearts of the citizens. Michael, always the businessman with a sharp sense of community and justice, offered financial assistance to Henry so he could reclaim his life and profession. With a generous loan, he enabled Henry to reopen his workshop. "I always dreamed of getting back to fixing watches," Henry shared with a twinkle in his eyes, as he carefully organized his tools in the new workshop, located in a charming building in the city center. Alice, whose diligent writing and compassion had helped turn the tide for Henry, continued to cover the story. Her articles not only illuminated the events, but also contextualized the importance of justice and community support. On the day of the new workshop's opening, Alice was there, camera in hand, and a smile on her face. "This is a beautiful turnaround, Henry. I'm so happy for you," she commented as she watched the first curious customers enter through the freshly painted gateway. Henry, standing at the door of his new workshop, smiled back at Alice. "All thanks to you and Michael. I don't know how to thank you enough." His words were simple, but the weight of his gratitude was palpable. "You've already thanked me, Henry. The best way to pay it back is to keep doing what you love," Alice replied, her gentle tone underscoring the depth of her conviction. As Henry waved to another customer entering, he felt revitalized, not just by the renewal of his career, but by the strengthening of his faith in the community and justice. The shop, after overcoming a whirlwind of adversities, Henry finally found a haven of peace and dignity in his new watchmaking workshop. The small space, located in the heart of the city, became more than just a place for repairs and creating watches. It was a true symbol of hope and resilience for the entire community. The workshop's walls, adorned with clocks of various styles and eras, echoed stories of persistence and redemption. The customers who visited the workshop were drawn not only by Henry's unparalleled skill, but also by the strength of his personal story. Many came from afar, moved by curiosity and the desire to support a man whose life exemplified the ability to overcome. "The precision of his work is as remarkable as his own life," often remarked a loyal customer, a retired teacher who made it a point to bring her old watch for maintenance, even if it didn't need it. Meanwhile, Alice, whose pen and determination had played a crucial role in turning Henry's life around, rose to journalistic stardom. Her ability to unravel and narrate deeply human and inspiring stories earned her national recognition. Her book about the interactions and impact of Henry and Michael on each other's lives became a bestseller, touching the hearts of readers across the country. In lectures and interviews, Alice always emphasized the importance of listening and believing in people's stories, a lesson she had learned and deeply valued. "Each person is a living book, filled with chapters that deserve to be read with respect and empathy," she often said. Michael, on the other hand, experienced a profound sense of fulfillment. Helping Henry not only repaid the kindness received in the past, but also reaffirmed his commitment to values of compassion and justice. His already successful company continued to grow, and he used his position and influence to support social causes, particularly those aimed at assisting people in vulnerable situations. He always remembered his humble beginnings and sought to provide opportunities for others, just as Henry had done for him in the past. On a sunny afternoon, while reviewing some watches in his workshop, Henry reflected on the path he had traveled. The gratitude for Michael and Alice, and the ongoing support from his community, filled his heart with warmth. "Every tick-tock of these watches reminds me that time is a precious gift, and every moment is a new chance to make a difference," he thought, a smile forming on his lips as he carefully polished the dial of an old pocket watch. As the years passed, Henry's workshop not only repaired watches, but also rebuilt lives, offering a space where people could learn not just a craft, but about life itself. Henry, with his now silver hair and hands still firm and precise, became an emblematic figure in the community. He was not just a master watchmaker, but a mentor and a paternal figure to many young people who, often lost or on the margins of society, sought in the workshop not just technical learning, but also personal guidance. On a typical afternoon of work, as the soft sound of clocks filled the environment, Henry looked at a group of young apprentices concentrated at their benches. He approached, watched for a moment, and then with a calm and encouraging voice, shared his reflections. "No matter how difficult your journey may be, there will always be a way to rise again. The important thing is never to lose faith in yourself and in the goodness of people." These words, spoken with the sincerity of someone who had lived every syllable, resonated in the hearts of the young.